One man, 4 wives. A serial husband, leaving in his wake 3 divorces, 1 death, and a disappearance.
Hello everyone, this is your guy John again with another true crime story. There are some stories that make you question everything you believe about trust, power, and justice. Stories where the people sworn to protect us turn out to be the ones we should fear most. This is one of those stories. The story of Drew Peterson, the former Illinois police sergeant whose charm and confidence hid something much darker underneath. A man who spent years controlling everyone around him until his entire world finally came crashing down. To the outside world, Drew Peterson seemed like the perfect all-American cop. He was confident, well-spoken, and respected in his suburban community of Bolingbrook, Illinois. Neighbors described him as friendly, always waving from his patrol car. The kind of man who seemed to have everything under control. But behind closed doors, his family life told a very different story. One filled with jealousy, manipulation, and violence that would eventually lead to murder. Drew joined the Bolingbrook Police Department in the late 1970s. He quickly climbed the ranks, earning praise for his discipline and work ethic. It was charming, that kind of charisma that could convince anyone he was the good guy. But those who knew him personally say that charm had a purpose. It wasn't kindness. It was control. By the time he reached his 40s, Drew had already been married 3 times. Each relationship ended in drama and accusations. His 3rd wife, Kathleen Savio, would become the center of a storm that changed everything. Kathleen was smart, independent, and known for standing up for herself. When she and Drew married in 1992, friends thought they looked happy together. A hardworking police officer and a loving mother starting fresh. But behind the smiles, things were unraveling. Kathleen told friends that Drew was controlling and possessive. She said he monitored her calls, her movements, even her finances. When Drew met Stacy Cales, a young woman nearly 30 years younger than him, everything changed. He fell for her quickly, or maybe, more accurately, he targeted her. Stacy was only 17 when they met, still figuring out her life, while Drew was a seasoned police officer in his 40s. He promised her love, security, and a life she could depend on. But what Stacy didn't realize was that she was stepping into the same cycle of control that had already broken his previous marriages. By 2003, Drew and Kathleen's marriage had completely fallen apart. Their divorce was finalized, but the tension didn't end there. Kathleen feared for her life. She told multiple people, including police, that if something happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. She said Drew would be responsible. But like many women whose abusers wear badges, her warnings were brushed aside. In March 2004, Kathleen Savio was found dead in her bathtub. The scene looked strange from the start. There was no water in the tub, and her hair was matted with blood. She had a deep wound on the back of her head, and bruises covered her body. But police at the time, including some of Drew's own colleagues, called it an accident. They said she must have slipped and hit her head. Her death was ruled accidental drowning, and Drew walked away free. A few months later, he married Stacy. To their neighbors, they looked like a happy family. Drew, now in his 50s, with his young new wife and growing children. But friends close to Stacy noticed changes. She became quieter, more anxious, and withdrawn. She told her pastor that she was afraid of Drew, that she wanted to leave him but didn't know how. In October 2007, Stacy vanished. One day she was home with her kids, and the next, she was gone. Drew told everyone she had run off with another man, leaving him to care for their children. But her family didn't believe that for a second. Stacy adored her kids. She would never abandon them. Her disappearance sparked national attention. Suddenly, Drew Peterson wasn't the charming cop anymore. He was the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. As reporters flooded Bolingbrook, the world started to uncover the truth about his past. Investigators began re-examining Kathleen Savio's death, and what they found changed everything. The original investigation had been sloppy. No autopsy photos, minimal evidence collection, and interviews that seemed rushed. Many now believed that police had gone easy on one of their own. When Kathleen's body was exhumed for a second autopsy, the results were clear. Her death was not an accident. The pathologist concluded she had been murdered, likely drowned after being knocked unconscious. That ruling blew the case wide open. Drew maintained his innocence, smiling for cameras and joking during interviews. He acted like a man with nothing to hide, but that confidence, that smirk, only made the public hate him more. It was as if he believed he could manipulate everyone again, just like he had done for years. Friends of both women came forward, sharing disturbing stories. Kathleen had once called police multiple times after violent arguments. She told friends that Drew would sneak into her house, even after their divorce. Stacy had confided that she knew details about Kathleen's death. Details Drew had told her privately. She said she was terrified. Police searched Drew's home, his vehicles, and even the ponds near his house. They seized computers, cell phones, and firearms. But without Stacy's body, prosecutors had to focus on Kathleen's case. In 2009, Drew Peterson was arrested and charged with the murder of Kathleen Savio. The trial that followed became one of the most publicized in Illinois history. Cameras flashed as Drew, dressed in a sharp suit, walked confidently into the courtroom. He smiled, joked, and even winked at reporters. It was chilling, as if he saw the entire trial as another performance. Prosecutors built their case on circumstantial evidence, testimony from friends, and Drew's own history of threats and abuse. Several witnesses claimed that both Kathleen and Stacy had expressed fear of him. One even recalled Stacy saying, "I know he killed her. I just don't know how to prove it." The defense tried to paint Drew as a misunderstood husband, arguing that Kathleen's death had been a tragic accident, but the jury wasn't buying it. They saw through the charm. They saw a man who had spent years manipulating those closest to him, and who had finally gone too far. After weeks of testimony, Drew was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. The verdict shocked some, but for others, it was long overdue. When the judge sentenced him to 38 years in prison, Drew barely reacted. He just stood there, emotionless. For a man who always believed he could talk his way out of anything, that silence said everything. But even as he was led away in handcuffs, Drew still had one card left to play: his arrogance. He told reporters he was innocent, that the system had turned against him, that this was all part of a conspiracy. He claimed Stacy had left him, that she was alive somewhere, and that one day she'd come back to prove his innocence. No one believed him. For Kathleen's family, the verdict brought some relief, but it didn't erase the years of pain. For Stacy's family, it wasn't enough. Because Stacy was still missing. Without her body, there could be no funeral, no closure, no peace. As Drew adjusted to prison life, his true nature only became more visible. He bragged about his fame to other inmates. He joked about being a celebrity. It was as if he still thought he was in control, even behind bars. But prison walls have a way of stripping that illusion away. The man who once wore the badge of honor was now just another inmate number. Still, Drew refused to fade into obscurity. He wrote letters to journalists, gave phone interviews, and continued to play the victim. In one message, he said, "They can't silence me. I know the truth, and one day, everyone else will too." It was classic Drew, defiant, manipulative, and self-absorbed. Meanwhile, investigators continued to search for any sign of Stacy. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, her sister Cassandra would organize a candlelight vigil. She promised that as long as she was alive, she would never stop searching. Cassandra said, "I can still feel her presence. I just want to bring her home." Her voice carried the pain of someone who had spent years chasing hope in the shadows. Despite countless searches, tips, and theories, Stacy's body has never been found. Some believe Drew hid her in one of the ponds near his home. Others think he had helped disposing of her remains. But without proof, her case remains one of Illinois' most haunting mysteries. For Drew Peterson, the years in prison didn't change him. They exposed him. In 2015, while serving his sentence, he was caught trying to hire a hitman to kill the prosecutor who had put him away. He offered another inmate money and instructions on how to make it happen. But that inmate went straight to the authorities. Drew was charged again and convicted of solicitation of murder. The judge added another 40 years to his sentence. At that point, any remaining sympathy he might have had disappeared completely. He had become exactly what everyone feared he was: a man consumed by control, even when he had none left. Today, Drew Peterson is serving his time in an Illinois prison, likely for the rest of his life. He's in his 70s now, older, quieter, and no longer in the headlines. But for the families of Kathleen Savio and Stacy Peterson, the wounds he left behind never healed. Even now, Stacy's sister still holds on to hope that someday someone will find her. That one last piece of truth will finally surface. And while Drew sits behind bars, the world outside remembers him not as the hero cop he once pretended to be, but as a reminder that evil doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes it wears a uniform. When the courtroom doors closed behind Drew Peterson, many thought the story was finally over. The justice system had done its job, the murderer was behind bars, and the families could finally rest. But the truth is, Drew Peterson's story didn't end with a prison sentence. It only transformed into something darker, stranger, and even more disturbing. In the years after his conviction, the world watched as Drew turned prison into another stage for his performance. Reporters still wrote his name, talk shows mentioned him, and even from a concrete cell, Drew seemed determined to keep himself in the spotlight. For a man who thrived on control and attention, isolation wasn't punishment, it was a challenge. Inside the Illinois Department of Corrections, inmates had their own opinions about him. Some saw him as a celebrity, a former cop who had fallen from grace. Others despised him for what he'd done, not just because of the crimes, but because he had betrayed the very badge he once wore. In a place where respect was everything, being an ex-cop and a convicted murderer made him both feared and hated. Yet, Drew found ways to manipulate even that. He joked with guards, told exaggerated stories about his crazy ex-wives, and tried to build small alliances. He played the role of the victim, insisting that everyone misunderstood him. When a local reporter once asked what prison life was like, Drew replied, "It's just another job. You get up, follow the routine, and deal with the people around you." But beneath that false calm, there was still anger. The same arrogance that had fueled his downfall continued to drive him. He couldn't stand that people thought he'd lost. He couldn't stand that Kathleen and Stacy's names were remembered, while his was cursed. Inmates who later spoke out described him as manipulative and unpredictable. Some said he bragged about knowing how to make people disappear. Others claimed he still laughed about fooling the media. But the joke was on him, because even as he tried to play tough, his control was slipping away more each day. His children were growing up without him. 2 of them, shared with Stacy, were raised by her sister Cassandra. Others, from previous marriages, distanced themselves completely. One of his older sons said he no longer wanted to be associated with his father, saying, "He's not the man I thought he was." For Drew, that was the deepest cut. The image of the strong family man he'd built over the years had finally collapsed. His charm no longer mattered. His power was gone, and the silence he once forced on others had come back for him. In 2013, Drew tried to appeal his conviction, claiming the trial had been unfair. He argued that prosecutors had used hearsay evidence that people had testified about things Kathleen and Stacy had said, rather than presenting direct proof. But the court rejected his arguments. The verdict stood. The state of Illinois had no doubt Drew Peterson was guilty. By 2015, his frustration turned into desperation. That's when he made the move that sealed his fate forever. It started with a quiet conversation in prison, a conversation he thought was private. Drew began talking to another inmate, someone he believed he could trust. He complained about the man who had prosecuted him, Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow. Drew said he wanted revenge, that Glasgow had ruined his life. Then he took it a step further. He offered money to have Glasgow killed. He told the inmate he had connections outside, people who could help carry it out. He described how he wanted it done, even suggesting that the hitman make it look like an accident. It was the same pattern, control, manipulation, and violence, repeating itself again and again. But what Drew didn't know was that the inmate he was confiding in wasn't loyal to him. That man went straight to authorities. The Illinois State Police launched a sting operation, recording conversations between Drew and the informant. On those recordings, Drew's voice was cold and matter-of-fact, planning a murder from behind bars. When news broke, the public was stunned. Not because Drew had tried to commit another crime, but because it proved what many had already believed. He would never stop. In 2016, he went back to court, this time wearing the same orange jumpsuit he'd mocked other prisoners for. The trial was shorter. the evidence overwhelming. He was convicted of solicitation of murder and sentenced to an additional 40 years. Combined with his existing sentence, it meant Drew Peterson would die in prison. For the families, it was another wave of emotions: shock, anger, and exhaustion. Kathleen's sister said, "He's exactly where he belongs, but he still finds ways to hurt people." Cassandra, Stacy's sister, said, "He took everything from us, but he still won't tell the truth." Over time, Drew's fame faded. The interviews stopped. The headlines moved on. He was transferred to a federal facility for his own safety after reports that other inmates had targeted him. From there, letters occasionally surfaced. Short, bitter messages claiming he'd been frummed, that the women in his life had turned the world against him. One of those letters ended with the line, "History will remember me differently." But the truth is, history already had. Outside the prison walls, people still remembered Stacy. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, friends and family gathered to release balloons into the sky, each one carrying her name, her memory, and a message of hope. Her children, now young adults, often stayed away from cameras, living quiet lives under new names. But those who knew them say they carry both their mother's strength and her sadness. There were rumors, of course. Some said Drew had hidden Stacy's body in a blue barrel and dumped it in a nearby canal. Others believed she might be buried somewhere on property he once owned. Police followed every lead, searched ponds, fields, and forests. But every time, they came up empty. Cassandra still refused to give up. "In an interview years later," she said, "as long as I'm breathing, I'll keep looking." I owe that to her. Her words echoed through Illinois, a testament to the kind of love that doesn't fade, even when justice feels out of reach. For the people of Bolingbrook, Drew's story left a permanent scar. He wasn't just another criminal, he was one of them. A local cop who'd worn the uniform, smiled at parades, and promised to protect the community. His downfall shattered the illusion of safety that small towns often cling to. Many officers who had once worked with him said they still struggled with guilt. Some admitted they ignored warning signs. Others confessed that the culture at the time protected its own. "If we'd listened to Kathleen," one former officer said, "maybe Stacy would still be alive." That haunting thought lingers even now. In the years since, the case of Drew Peterson has become more than just a crime story. It's been studied in psychology courses, discussed in law schools, and featured in documentaries as a chilling example of narcissism, manipulation, and abuse of power. Experts have called him a textbook sociopath, charming, calculating, and utterly lacking empathy. When asked to describe him, one forensic psychologist said, "Drew Peterson is the kind of man who believes rules don't apply to him. He's not driven by rage, he's driven by control. Taking lives was his ultimate way of maintaining it." In 2017, a TV movie based on his life aired, dramatizing the events leading up to Kathleen's death and Stacy's disappearance. The film reignited public interest, but for the families, it was painful. They didn't need reminders of Drew's story. They lived with its consequences every day. Meanwhile, Drew continued to age behind bars. Reports from inside said he kept mostly to himself, reading newspapers and occasionally watching TV. Some inmates said he still bragged about his past. Others sighed. He'd grown quiet, haunted by the ghosts of his own actions. But no matter how many years passed, he never confessed. He never said where Stacy was. He never took responsibility. Time, however, has a way of erasing the power of even the most arrogant men. Drew's health began to decline. He moved more slowly, spoke less, and appeared visibly older in the rare photos that surfaced. The once proud officer, who strutted with confidence, was now a frail man in a gray uniform, just another face in a long list of forgotten criminals. But for the families, the pain remained timeless. Every year that passed without Stacy's body felt like another year stolen. Every holiday, every birthday, was another reminder of what Drew had taken. There is something profoundly unsettling about the way his story ends, not with a confession or redemption, but with silence. Because silence was always his weapon. He used it to control, to intimidate, to keep his secrets buried. And even now, that silence continues to hold power. The question that still echoes today isn't whether Drew Peterson is guilty. It's what really happened to Stacy. What were her final moments like? Did she realize what was coming? Did she try to run, to fight, to scream? Those questions may never be answered, but they hang in the air like unfinished sentences. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all, that even in death, his victims' stories remain incomplete. Yet, despite the darkness, there's also something unbreakable in the people who continue to fight for truth. Cassandra's determination, the investigators who refused to stop digging, the journalists who kept his story alive. They've turned tragedy into a kind of quiet resistance. Today, Drew Peterson sits in a maximum security facility under constant supervision. His days are repetitive. Breakfast at dawn, roll calls, and the long silence of confinement. Sometimes, new inmates recognize his name, whispering, "That's the cop who killed his wife." But to most, he's just another old man serving time. There are no interviews now. No cameras. No spotlight. Just walls, memories, and time. 3 things Drew can never manipulate. When you think about the story of Drew Peterson, it's not just about murder or justice. It's about power, how it can corrupt, how it can destroy, and how sometimes it hides behind the smile of someone who's supposed to protect you. It's about how people like Kathleen Savio and Stacy Peterson tried to speak up, but were ignored. About how the system, flawed and human, sometimes needs tragedy to wake up. And about how even after all these years, one man's evil can't erase the strength of the women he tried to silence. As of now, Drew Peterson is in his 70s, serving what is effectively a life sentence. He will die behind bars. The world outside has moved on, but the shadows of his actions still linger in Bolingbrook. In the houses where families once whispered about the charming cop next door, in the hearts of those who still light candles for Stacy, and in the echoes of a story that refuses to be forgotten. Because the truth is, justice isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of remembering. And if there's one thing to take from this story, it's this. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it smiles. Sometimes, it wears a badge. And sometimes, it lives next door.